Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
China is the world's fastest growing economy, undergoing almost a second industrial revolution. So what does that mean for the United States? Stay tuned. We'll talk more about that. Dialogue is next. Hello, I'm Joan Cartan-Hansen. Thank you for joining us here on Idaho Public Television, on the World Wide Web, and on public radio stations. China is the most populous country on Earth, with the world's second largest economy. Its culture stretches back continuously for nearly 4,000 years. But China has undergone some dramatic changes in the decades since it reopened relationships with the United States. More trade, more cultural exchange. And yet China remains a mystery to many Americans. But perhaps not to this man. Robert Oxnam was president of the Asia Society for 11 years and has gone on to advise presidents and corporate leaders about China. He's been a visiting professor at Beijing University. He's the author of several nonfiction books and articles and 2 fictional stories about China. He's in Idaho speaking at the Frank Church Institute's annual conference, and he joins me now. Thank you, sir, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And I'm sorry, because this is a tape program, we're not taking phone calls, but we do have a few Facebook and email questions for our guests. But let me start out by asking, why is China still a mystery to Americans?
I think in part because we grew up as a society which looked more across the Atlantic than across the Pacific. The great divide between our two societies, we all grew up with the notion that if we dug through the earth, we could get to China. It was that far away. So it was pretty far from our consciences for most Americans. But there were, all the way back to the 19th century, there were traders, there were missionaries. But China, over the course of the last 100 years, has also been changing so rapidly, from an imperial system to a nationalist government, warlords, 1949, the communist takeover, cultural revolution followed by modernization. It's almost hard for Chinese themselves not to consider it a mystery that they went this far. So mystery, I think, is built into the perception we have around the relationship.
Considering the speed of that evolution of China, what have been perhaps the greatest changes in China in the last few decades?
Well, I first went to China in 1974, right in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And it's important to recognize that the baseline that they started at was a remarkably poor country, one that was politically exhausted after a Cultural Revolution, very limited amount of industrialization, largely a farming country. And the changes that just anybody who can take a snapshot in the 1970s and a snapshot today would see perhaps the most dramatic change of any society on earth. You see it in terms of buildings. You see it in terms of infrastructure. China, in many ways, riding on China's highways or riding on China's trains, feels leagues ahead of where we are because it's all new technology. The changes in lifestyle are apparent, from wearing old drab Mao suits to people wearing sort of modern business dress. And the income that people have has gone, not for all Chinese, but for many urban dwellers who are sort of middle class today, has just skyrocketed. So consumer goods that you see all over the place. And finally, you see it in terms of where people work and how they work. The emergence of private enterprise, the emergence of modern buildings which house a lot of businesses from abroad, but increasingly those from China itself. So almost any part of life that you put your finger on, there's a transformation of almost 180 degrees in a period of 40 years.
How much change has there been in the political side of the structure? Obviously, there's been a huge economic shift. Right. How much change is on the politics side?
A considerable amount, but if you measure it as authoritarianism to democracy, they're in between. It's a country which was autocratic when I first went there. Chairman Mao was in power, and people carried the little red book, and there were big demonstrations, all orchestrated by the government. Today, there has been a change because there have been a succession of leaders who have emphasized economy but realized that a degree of political opening is critical to keeping themselves in power and keeping the country on track. And so what do we mean by this? In 2002, the Chinese government communist government officially welcomed capitalists as part of the party. Old man Mao Zedong would have rolled at his grave at that notion, but essentially they recognized that business and government have to collaborate. Increasingly, I taught at Beijing University, as you suggested, and increasingly students have an input, as do people in different parts of the country, as to expressing their opinions, not in a concretely democratic way, but in a way that their ideas do filter up and make a difference. So there is a kind of public opinion surveying that's going on in China. So all of that is a more open society. Are they going to become democratic? Maybe someday, but I think it's 25 or 30 or 50 years ahead if it occurs at all. Right now, most people are driven by a kind of a sense of economic nationalism. As long as the economy keeps going like this, and the government stays relatively soft authoritarian, I think most people are quite content.
Premier Wen Jiabao is one of those who's pushing a little bit more for reform, but not too much.
Yeah, I mean, Wen Jiabao, who's the prime minister.
Yeah.
The president is Hu Jintao. And they're both, strong members of the party, but he's been called by some Chinese Uncle One because he has a softer touch and all of that. And he has talked about a kind of gradual reform. He's even used the word democracy, but I don't think he means it in a kind of Jeffersonian Western sense. What he does mean to imply by that China, while its primary emphasis is on growth and stability, also recognizes that a degree of political opening is going to be needed over time. He has not specified what he means by that precisely, and he has not said it for some months now. So it clearly is a question of, I believe, a personal feeling on his part. But I don't think we should sit back and say that the reforms are likely to occur in a massive way in a short period of time.
What do you think they learned from Tiananmen Square?
They learned Tiananmen Square, the horrendous killing of a number of young Chinese who were demonstrating really for greater political openness. I think they learned 2 or 3 things from that. One is you sure don't want to have a mass demonstration in Tiananmen Square that you want to control and make sure that doesn't happen again. That's the authoritarian side. The other side they learned, though, is that if you don't have a degree of opening, if you don't involve more people in governance, you're going to end up perhaps solving an economic problem while you're creating a new political problem. And there are a number of people, therefore, who have been pushing for the party and the government to be more open. I think the final thing they learned is that the outside world is watching. And it was a tragic moment for China. It cost them, by the way, the Olympics in the year 2000 because of Tiananmen. And so when they finally had the Olympics, they were trying to put on display a more open, vibrant, culturally sensitive China. So I think they learned a good bit from it. I don't think they're likely to have another repeat of that. And I think most of all, they want to create a society which does open, but at a pace commensurate with maintaining stability. And what makes the Communist Party happy, ideally make the government more happy, and perhaps make the majority of people able to go along and feel a sense of identity.
So after the earthquakes, there's a fair amount of criticism in China from the people as schools collapsed. There's obviously corruption in terms of the healing process. But it didn't appear to many Americans that those people were being heard, that there was more, because that was destabilizing. Was that an incorrect assumption?
That's a question that's been debated. My own feeling is they were heard, but they weren't heard exactly the way that they would be heard in an American setting. I think the first reaction was too slow on the part of the government, and now they've had other earthquakes since. They've had terrible snowstorms,
flooding.
one jiabao flooding.
Yeah.
One jiabao is usually sent down to try to respond. But I think built in there is another lesson, and that is that China does not have democracy, but it has a way of showing public opinion when things happen. And last year, in fact, the Chinese, very strangely, they record the number of public demonstrations and strikes each year and publish the list. I think it's the only place on earth. I think it's mainly because there was an imperial tradition of doing the same. And last year there were 93,000 strikes and demonstrations around China. And essentially what's happening is the top of the government is sort of tracking these because they are worried about elements of instability. And increasingly the question of providing responses to disasters, providing social safety nets for people who are kind of left out of the rich class in China become very important issues. And so I think they're also learning from their response, their lack of initial response to the earthquake in Sichuan.
Let me get to one of our questions that came on Facebook. What is the expected effect of rising consumer income in China on broad U.S. China relations over the next decade?
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating question. The rising consumer income is really remarkable. We always talk about politics and macroeconomic policy. The real key to China's modernization is its middle class. And we're probably dealing, it depends how you measure it, but probably 30% of China right now is middle class, 35%. Some estimates say within 10 years, 70% of China will be middle class. Now, these are people who are making at least $12,500 a year. Now, that doesn't sound big, but in China, that goes a lot further. And it does mean that purchasing of homes, purchasing of cars, purchasing of consumer goods, we would feel quite comfortable, not because they're large homes, but because a lot of the electronic equipment that we find in Chinese homes, very similar to what we have in the U.S. today. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's a class that China depends on. So increasingly, not only their taste in the marketplace, but their feelings about local issues and politics and all. And most politics is local politics
that's right.
anyway, right?
All politics is local.
Absolutely, and it's same is true in China, and so they have that leverage. And the final thing that they have is that it's very interesting. In the United States, when you take opinion polls about do most people think they're going to be better off in the next generation, the polls say no. Most of us are getting rather dubious about that. And in China, every time you take it, they have a sense of it's going in the right direction. Now, so the policy towards the middle class is not only important today, it's because they're making a bet on the future. They're making a bet on the next generation. So it gets wrapped up in the whole question is, does the government deliver properly in terms of jobs, in terms of education, in terms of what younger Chinese think? So that is completely different from what one would see 20 years ago, and certainly not 40 years ago.
The trade imbalance is a huge issue. The currency is a huge issue. Do you see a resolution coming out of the government?
Well, I mean, both of those are related. The trade imbalance has been there for some time, and we've seen an enormous growth in U.S. China trade. I mean, so U.S. exports to China, of course, have increased enormously, but the imports of goods from China have increased even more to the United States, and that's the cause of the imbalance. I think that's going to be an ongoing question, and it will depend on sort of overall structure of both societies. Part of it depends on managing deficit and spending. Part of it demands really working for complete market opening on the other side. That remains an issue. The currency question has come dead center. And it's a kind of arcane subject when you really get into all the details of it. But essentially what we're dealing with is the Chinese RMB, which is yuan, their unit of currency, and the dollar are pegged at the same level now. And the U.S. is saying, I think with some justification, that it was pegged at an artificially low level. So the only time that we get the yuan to go up is when the dollar goes up. And the dollar goes down, so they go down with it. So we never can manage the difference. Right. And what many Americans would like is to completely float the currency so they're international factors rather than just linkage to the dollar. And the Chinese have sort of marginally moved into the area of trying to have a 2 or 3% change, but not in a massive way. Why is this so important? It's important because of the fact that the price of currency, the valuation of currency, is a fundamental determinant on whether exports are cheap or they're dear.
Right.
And we have this flood, of course, of Chinese consumer products. Every time we go to Walmart or Nike or whatever, we're buying Chinese products. But they're being made by American companies who are then re-exporting to the United States. And as a result, there's a hope that there would be an increase in the value of the yuan over time, maybe 5 or 10%. But then the Chinese response to that is, okay, Americans, we're a new modernizer. Why shouldn't we get the same break you guys got back 50 years ago? And when Wen Jiabao and Barack Obama talked in New York back in September, Wen Jiabao said to him, look, you make this big argument about the workers in Seattle. What about the workers in Shenzhen? And so the currency issue gets totally wrapped up in the whole question of that. Am I an optimist about it? I'm an optimist about most things, but it's going to require huge negotiations to make a significant difference here.
Well, now as the middle class increases and salaries increase in China, then jobs are being exported to India and other parts of the world. So they're losing because obviously they're demanding more salaries. So is China worried about its job base?
You know, it's yes, they have some worries in that, although let's realize that China is a new, it's a scale. It's a scale question. And much of the Asia Pacific world is growing around them. Sometimes we just talk about U.S. China relations as if it was just one bilateral relationship apart from the rest of the world. And the Asia Pacific region, of course, is growing around it. And therefore, they have to think carefully about it. China has two interesting aspects to the job question. One is that because they've had a long-term policy of managing a one-child family system now for 30 years, it has tended to take the demography of China in a similar way to what we've seen in Japan, so that you've got a much older population, which means numbers of workers is going to be a question over time. That's the headache that they need to manage, and one way they're managing it is easing up on the one-child family system. So depends on the region you're talking about. We're just beginning to get somewhat larger families. But the other thing about jobs is that the Chinese have been very effective moving their workers abroad. And so there's substantial numbers of places, particularly North Africa, where not only are they trading there, they are also sending teams of workers, building infrastructure, building hospitals, building schools. They become, in effect, a one-stop shop for modernizing economy and extracting resources using Chinese labor. So labor is a very, very complicated and interesting part of the story.
Which then gets into a whole other round of human rights in Africa and Asia.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the places they do this is Sudan, of course. And then you get into the question of, are you sort of trading with the ultimate human rights violator in order to support your own economy? You know, as an American, one must be careful in making these accusations because we have had a rather checkered past ourselves.
Let me get to another email question. Why can't China let Tibet have some independence to practice their faith? What are they afraid of?
Tibet's a very complicated question, and I just want to say, as I hear the question, very good question. I have a great deal of sympathy for the questioner and the sensibilities behind it. I have met the Dalai Lama on several occasions and have been had the privilege of interviewing him at one point. And to me, he's a remarkable religious leader and also a very powerful politician running around the world, winning Nobel Prizes and going to Washington and all of this. He's a fighter for a cause. The Chinese communists have a very harsh record from time to time in Tibet, and I just as someone who believes in human rights am overwhelmed by that. Chinese are also argue, though, that they have had a sovereignty over Tibet since the 17th century. It happens to be true. It was under the last dynasty of the Chinese, the Qing dynasty. And there was a kind of suzerainty that was provided. Tibetans didn't always like it, but I suppose you could read it as white settlers and Native Americans. We can sort of understand some of this. From the point of view of China, sovereignty is a huge issue. And the areas that are most sensitive in sovereignty are, number one, Taiwan. They would love to get back Taiwan or create a closer accommodation. In some ways, they're going in a better direction there. The second area is Tibet. Mm-hmm. And the third one, almost nobody's heard of, is Xinjiang province, which is the western part of China where minority Uyghurs live. And in each case, the Chinese see themselves as being in charge. And the Chinese are, after a long period of imperialism, are extremely sensitive about anything that might get to sovereignty. So letting Tibet go would raise questions about Taiwan, would raise questions about Xinjiang. They're not about to do that. The real question is, will the Chinese recognize over time that there needs to be some kind of a political accommodation that no longer looks at the Dalai Lama as a cruel, rapacious figure the way they describe it, but instead establishes a dialogue that would allow the tensions on Tibet to begin to moderate and allow the rest of the world not to be focused on China so often through the prism of Tibet. Yeah. So it's in their interest, in our interest, but we sure know that when issues of sovereignty come up, people can be very stubborn.
Hong Kong, obviously, how has that transition from in British rule? And how is Hong Kong? How is China tenderly handling Hong Kong?
Well, it's sometimes tenderly, sometimes not too tenderly, but for the most part, tenderly. The situation in Hong Kong is very interesting. A compromise was raised that when 1997 it reverted to Chinese sovereignty, and Hong Kong became a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. But it operated in a wonderful phrase. You have to have great phrases to understand China. They make such good ones themselves. But one country, two systems. So Hong Kong was part of China, but at least for 50 years after 1997, that's 2047, there would be a capitalist democratic system of governance, such as the British had in Hong Kong, that would be continued. For the most part, they've allowed that to happen. Now, it requires shrewd politics on the parts of leaders in Hong Kong, and it requires a constant watching from Beijing. For the most part, Hong Kong has done relatively well economically. There have been moments in which there's a sense that press freedom is being controlled a bit more than they would like. But to go and visit in Hong Kong, as I frequently do, the biggest difference is the British are gone and there are more mainland Chinese that are there. But a lot of the commerce, a lot of the deal making with Hong Kong, which is the lifeblood of Hong Kong, continues as it was before.
So you can keep the money flowing. The rest of the stuff you can kind of deal with.
Well, we're dealing with South Chinese. And Southern Chinese, are merchants. And they've always had that idea. It's really true. There's so many things that we think of through the prism of political change, where there are continuities underneath that are really the cohesive forces in those societies. So autocracy has lots of roots, but also does freewheeling commerce.
What myths do Americans have about China? And conversely, what myths do Chinese have about Americans?
It's interesting. There was a wonderful book written many years ago by a MIT professor that described myths as they've evolved over time. I think one of the myths that we have today, which probably wasn't a full myth 50 years ago, but is that it's an absolutely autocratic regime. And everybody marches to the same drummer. Look, I've been on the Beijing University campus as a professor, and I've talked with students away from anybody listening. They have more opinions than you can imagine. And they even have ways of having those opinions heard. Do they feel it's a completely free and open society? No. Would they like to see more? I think yes. But the old myth that the Chinese were sort of blue ants under a communist master, that's not really true. I think probably another myth that we have about the Chinese is that somehow systemically communism can't be adapted to a rapidly moving capitalist society. The Chinese disproved that in the past 20 years enormously. You go back in the 80s, that was a myth. The myths, Chinese know more about us than we know about them. There are almost 300 million Chinese studying English, and just a bare 100,000 or more studying Chinese in the United States. They read hugely, they follow the internet, and they know a lot about us. So the myths have tended to drop away. There were a lot of people, I think, who looked upon the United States in years gone by as a kind of brutal capitalist, invasive country, CIA-driven in all of its aspects. And I think that's pretty well dropped away. There is a myth that when you come to the United States, you can get into a university and you immediately get a good job. There was that notion that you had a U.S. degree. It doesn't always work that way, and in fact, these days, if you go to a Chinese university and get a good degree, you're almost guaranteed to get a job. But myths go on. Myths go on.
And in the 30 seconds that we have left or so, what one thing do you want people to know about China that they may not know?
I think maybe the single most important thing is that, in many ways, it is the fact that we're becoming closer that makes things difficult now. People over there, like people here, care about family, they care about jobs, they care about security, they care about education, they care about consumer goods, and they care about the relationship helping to work both ways. Single most important ingredient is what I would call sort of vigilant empathy on both sides so that we understand each other better.
Thank you, sir. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I appreciate you joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about Robert Oxnam and his work and about China, you can go to our website at idahoptv.org. There you'll find more links and facts and our Web Extra conversation. And speaking of that Web Extra conversation, we'll be exploring a totally different part of Mr. Oxnam's life. In that conversation, in 2005, Robert wrote a book, an autobiography, A Fractured Mind, in which he describes his life with multiple personality disorder. It's a fascinating story about a brave journey, and we'll talk about that in our Web Extra conversation. And you can watch that interview on our website. Go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. You'll also find us on Facebook. Search for Dialogue on Idaho Public Television and become a fan, or look for both this show and the Web Extra conversation on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you here next time on Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web.